Matthew Crane sat alone in the back of the diner, a cup of cold coffee trembling slightly in his hand as he lifted it. His eyes rested on the security camera screen, replaying moments from the drizzly morning the day before. A young man, skinny, wearing a tattered hoodie, stood quietly by the pastry case, his eyes quickly scanning the golden waffles before glancing toward the door as if afraid someone might see him. There was a single moment of hesitation. Then the young man reached out, slipped a waffle into his pocket, hunched his shoulders, and took a step back toward the door. And in that moment, Ava, the brown-haired employee with her hair tied back, who had been wiping down the counter nearby, looked up and met his gaze. Matthew saw that look clearly. It was not the look of a thief, but the tired, reddened eyes of someone both afraid and silently pleading, "Please, don't catch me." But Ava didn't call out to him. She simply nodded slightly, then turned away, continuing to wipe down the already spotless counter as if she hadn't seen a thing. And Matthew, who had built the Crane's Hearth bakery chain from a rusty old cart at the age of 23, froze that frame. The young man's eyes, Ava's silent nod, it was like a scratch small, but quietly burning. He had once been that boy, shivering in front of a bread shelf on a street corner, counting out his coins, 25 cents short of buying an old loaf, only to be glared at and thrown out by the shop owner. He had promised himself never to be that weak again, and to keep that promise, he turned himself into a hardened man, believing in rules over kindness. Matthew always believed if you give too easily, people will take everything. He no longer believed in stories of hardship, of hunger. People would take the bread, then the coffee, then everything he had, and leave without a single thank you. He trusted the numbers in his ledgers, the end-of-day reports, more than the eyes of strangers. But that morning, the stolen waffle, worth just $1, awakened memories Matthew had buried for 29 years, and those eyes, sad but still holding on to a glimmer of hope, a tiny hope that someone might not see him as trash, struck Matthew's heart like a distant bell. Matthew couldn't sleep that night. He sat by the bakery window, watching the rain fall against the foggy glass, listening to the drip of water on the tin roof, the ticking of the clock in the silent space, and inside his mind, one question echoed over and over. When did I forget how to see people as people? Perhaps it wasn't the waffle that had been stolen. Perhaps he had stolen from himself the compassion and the memory of a child once trembling in hunger. And Matthew knew that tomorrow he would have to face Ava, face that young man, and more than that, face the person he had become after years of running from weakness. What he didn't know was that this confrontation would change his life, this bakery, and the lives of people quietly living with hidden wounds no one else could see. The wind chime above the door of Crane's Hearth Bakery jingled softly as Ava came in for the early shift. She shook the rain from her thin jacket, rolled up her sleeves, wiped down the counter, and set freshly baked waffles in the display case. She didn't know that Matthew was sitting in the back, in the shadows, his eyes following her every movement, silently and heavily. Outside, the rain still fell, each drop tapping against the glass. The espresso machine hissed softly, the scent of freshly baked goods mixed with the damp chill of the morning air. Matthew opened his laptop, replayed the old camera footage, pausing on the moment when Ava looked at the young man, then turned away as if she hadn't seen anything. He pressed pause, his finger trembling on the key. His face reflected on the screen, showing tired, aging eyes still hiding their hardness. He stood up, walked out to the counter, and stood right behind Ava. "Do you know that boy?" His voice was deep and even, but it made the air turn cold. Ava flinched slightly, then calmly turned around, looking him straight in the eye. Her brown eyes did not flinch, did not fear. He was just a hungry kid. Matthew frowned. He stole from this shop. Ava was silent, her hands tightening together, but her voice remained calm. "I know." Silence filled the space. Only the ticking of the clock and the rain on the awning outside could be heard. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Matthew's teeth clenched lightly. His voice lowered. Ava looked directly into his eyes, her gaze holding no resentment, no fear, only resolve, because sometimes a piece of bread can save a life. Matthew froze for a moment. Her words dropped like a pebble into the quiet lake within him, sending ripples he could not see. "You think I don't understand? I was hungry once too. But if everyone takes bread without paying, this place will collapse." Matthew's voice rose, but his eyes were no longer as cold. They wavered, conflicted. Ava took a soft breath. "I know. But if one day you forget how to see a person with compassion, what meaning does this bakery still have?" Matthew. He opened his mouth to argue, but couldn't say a word. That question echoed in his mind, pulling him back to a rainy night 29 years ago, when he stood shivering by a shabby bread stand, a few cents short, chased away under a look of contempt. Outside, the door opened again, the bell jingling softly. Lucas walked in, his hoodie soaked, clutching the strap of an old backpack, eyes cast down to the floor, unable to look at anyone. His thin shoulders trembled. Raindrops dripped onto the tiled floor, leaving scattered specks of water. He stood in a corner, glanced at the pastry case, then turned away, heading for the door as if he was about to leave. Ava quickly wrapped a warm waffle, walked over, and gently set it on the counter near the door. She didn't say a word, only offered a gentle smile before returning to the counter. Lucas paused, his eyes meeting Ava's, his eyes red but holding a tiny, dim light that truly existed. Matthew stood in the back, witnessing everything, his fists clenched until his knuckles turned white, not out of anger, but because something was stirring in his chest. Lucas gave Ava a slight nod, took the waffle, and stepped out of the shop, leaving a small, silent, wet footprint on the floor. Matthew looked at Ava, asking softly, so quietly only she could hear, "You think you saved him?" Ava looked toward the door as it closed, taking a long breath. "I don't know, Matthew, but at least today, he doesn't have to go to sleep with an empty stomach." In that moment, Matthew realized there are battles not meant to be won, but meant to keep the humanity within us alive, even if it's just a small piece of bread on a rainy morning. And he didn't know that this boy, this Ava, and the silence of a rainy morning would change his life, quietly but deeply, like how the rain seeps into the earth, nurturing seeds of hope thought long dead. That night, Matthew sat alone in the small office behind the shop, the warm light highlighting the wrinkles carved by time on his face. On the desk lay revenue reports, ingredient invoices, employee payrolls, everything organized just as he managed his life. But tonight, the numbers on the paper could not ease his heart. The image of Lucas walking away, his thin hand clutching the waffle, his frail figure merging into the rainy night, kept replaying in Matthew's mind like an unrelenting reminder. He slowly raised a hand to rub the bridge of his nose, closing his eyes. And in that moment, Matthew saw himself at 17, huddled under the awning of an old corner store in Southside, his thin sweater soaked, clutching an old loaf of bread that a stranger had paid the missing coins for. That day, he looked at the stranger with astonished eyes, trembling as he said, "Thank you." The man only nodded, saying words Matthew would never forget. "Keep it, and someday, when you can, pass it on to someone else." He had once sworn he would never forget that day. Yet today, he had forgotten that old promise, forgotten that he had been hungry, had trembled, had once been grateful for a simple piece of bread. The rain tapped on the awning, its steady rhythm joining the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Matthew stood up, walked out of the office, passing the kitchen where Ava was washing cups. She looked up at him, her eyes a little tired but still determined. Still the eyes of someone ready to take responsibility for what they had done. He said nothing, only quietly walked past, pushing the door open into the cold night. Matthew walked through the old streets of Chicago, where he once roamed, selling pastries from a rusty cart at 23, where the police once chased him off sidewalks, where he had slept on park benches under a thin blanket. He looked at the homeless huddled in old sleeping bags under the bank's awning, their tired eyes still opening when people passed, afraid, wary, but deep inside still holding a fragile glimmer of hope. He stood under a streetlight, letting the cold rain strike his face, remembering the scent of warm bread from long ago, remembering the feeling when a stranger reached out a hand without asking whether he deserved it. When did I become the person who asks that question? Matthew wondered in the darkness. Returning to the bakery near midnight, Matthew opened the pastry case, took out a still warm waffle, placed it in a paper bag, then sat by the window looking out at the empty street. He didn't eat the waffle, only held it in his hands, its gentle warmth seeping into fingers hardened by years. For the first time in many years, Matthew felt he was no longer alone, as that waffle reminded him of life, kindness, and the promise he once made. The next morning, Matthew arrived at the shop earlier than usual. Ava was already there, wiping down the counter, preparing the first batch of pastries. He set the waffle from yesterday on the shelf near the door, looked at Ava, and said, "This morning, if that boy comes back, don't let him leave with an empty stomach." Ava looked up, her eyes wide, a sparkle of light in her brown eyes. She nodded gently, pressing her lips together to keep from crying. Matthew took a deep breath, but we need to do this the right way. That morning, Crane's hearth still smelled like waffles. Customers still came in for coffee, carrying with them their early morning stories. But something had changed. A small shelf was placed by the door, with a handwritten sign that read, "If you need one, take a pastry. No explanation needed." An elderly woman paused to read the sign, smiled, placed a $5 bill into the glass jar beside it, and walked away. A young boy stood hesitantly in front of the shelf, his eyes lighting up as he looked at the waffle, then looking up at Ava, who gave him a small nod and smiled. Matthew stood behind the counter, watching it all. In that moment, he realized that pastries taken weren't a loss, but part of the most precious capital of life, the connection between human beings. And when Ava's eyes met Matthew's, neither said a word, but they both understood that today they had begun to do something right. There was something different about that morning at Crane's hearth. It wasn't the smell of waffles or the rich scent of coffee, but the air itself felt warmer, lighter, as if the cracks in the space had been filled with the gentle light of sharing. Customers still came and went. The doorbell still jingled. Ava still smiled as she poured coffee. But Matthew found himself looking at the bakery with different eyes. He no longer only saw the numbers on the POS screen or the pastries sold, but began to notice the eyes of each person who walked through the door, the way they looked at the free pastry shelf by the exit. Near noon, the door opened, and there stood Lucas, his hoodie still damp with rain, clutching the strap of his backpack. He hesitated, his eyes glancing at the pastry shelf. Then he lowered his head, about to turn away. Ava stepped out from behind the counter, holding a cup of hot cocoa, steam rising softly in the morning light. "Wait." Lucas froze, turning around, his eyes wary, frightened, like a small bird that had just thought of escape only to find itself trapped again. Ava placed the cup of cocoa on the table near the pastry shelf. "Sit down. Drink it while it's hot." Lucas looked at her, then looked around, seeing that no one was paying attention, and he slowly walked over, shyly sitting down. His thin hands wrapped around the cup, fingers trembling slightly as the warmth seeped into his skin. Matthew watched from the counter, his hands resting on the wooden surface, gently clenching. A part of him still whispered, "What are you doing? This isn't a shelter." But another part, the part he had buried for too long, quietly spoke. "You were that hungry kid once. Don't forget." Lucas lowered his head, gently blowing on the cocoa foam, his eyes red, his voice as soft as a breath. I don't have any money." Ava sat down across from him, resting her arms on the table. "Today, you don't need to have money." Lucas looked up, tears welling in his eyes, his lips pressing together as he fought to keep the tears from falling. No one spoke, only the sound of rain outside on the awning and the warm steam rising from the cocoa between them. After a while, Lucas took a deep breath, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to steal. That day, I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I thought If I couldn't find anything that day, I would—" He stopped, his hands tightening around the cup. Ava placed her hand gently over his, softly saying, "That day, you didn't." Lucas broke down, tears streaming onto the wooden table, mixing with the rainwater on his sleeves. Matthew turned away, hiding the tears in his eyes. He stepped into the office, closed the door, sat down, his hands covering his head. He remembered that rainy night when he almost gave up everything because of an empty stomach and a tired heart. If it hadn't been for that stranger that day, if it hadn't been for that warm loaf of bread, he might not be here, might not have built this bakery, might not have become Matthew Crane. And he had forgotten. A while later, he stepped out to see Lucas quietly wiping his tears, Ava sitting next to him, gently patting his back, her eyes soft and patient. Matthew walked over, standing in front of Lucas. The boy looked up, eyes fearful, shoulders trembling. Matthew took a deep breath and placed a warm waffle on the table in front of him. "This time, it's for you. No apologies, no running." Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but Matthew raised his hand to signal him. "But starting tomorrow, if you want to eat here, you will work for it." Lucas blinked, his red eyes wide, as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. I can work here." Matthew nodded. "It won't be easy. You'll have to come early, wipe tables, take out trash, learn to serve customers. Here, everyone works to keep this place clean and warm." Lucas clutched the cup, tears falling again. But this time, they were not tears of fear, but of gratitude, of relief, and a small spark of hope in eyes that had been used to looking down. Ava smiled, placing her hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Don't be afraid. Here, none of us are perfect, but we will learn together how to be better people." Matthew looked at them both, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that inside his small bakery there was more than the smell of waffles and coffee. There was the scent of something even more important: compassion. Ending that part, Matthew turned back to the counter, beginning to prepare a new batch of dough. A strange peace settling in his heart as he understood Lucas began his first day at Crane's hearth on a cold morning when the sky was still grey and the light rain had not yet stopped. He arrived earlier than the agreed time, standing in front of the shop with his old hoodie, backpack slung over one shoulder, his hands fumbling as he clutched the strap, his eyes looking into the fogged glass, seeing his blurry reflection among the warm yellow lights inside. Ava was the first to open the door, her eyes briefly surprised before she smiled. "You're early." Lucas nodded, still looking down, his voice small. "I was afraid I wouldn't be accepted." Ava placed her hand on his shoulder. "Go wash your hands, then let's get started." The first day was not easy for Lucas. He fumbled while wiping tables, dropped spoons, spilled water on the floor, scalded his hand with hot coffee. Customers looked at him. Some frowned, some smiled encouragingly, while Lucas blushed, repeatedly whispering sorry under his breath. Matthew stood at the counter watching, his eyes strict, arms crossed. But beneath that sternness was a quiet patience. Every time Lucas spilled water, Matthew sighed softly but did not scold. Instead, he only said, "Wipe it up thoroughly. Next time, be careful before carrying the tray." And Lucas nodded, never arguing, never complaining, carefully wiping up every drop of water as if he was wiping away the old mistakes of his life. During the lunch break, Ava handed Lucas a hot waffle, placing it in his hands. "Eat. You need the energy." Lucas hesitated, his hands trembling, then looked up at Ava. Am I taking advantage of everyone's kindness?" Ava shook her head, smiling. "You're learning how to receive so that one day you'll know how to give." Lucas took a bite of the waffle, tears falling silently, mixing with the sweetness of the pastry, the warm scent of cinnamon filling his breath as it caught in his throat. That afternoon, the shop was busier than usual. Lucas worked alongside Ava, clearing tables, learning how to carry trays, how to greet customers, how to listen to orders. He was still clumsy, but his eyes were less fearful, starting to show sparks of light each time a customer said "thank you" or smiled at him. An elderly woman with grey hair, leaning on a cane, came to take a pastry from the free shelf near the door. She looked at Lucas, smiled, dropped a dollar bill into the donation jar, and said, "Thank you, son." Lucas froze, looking at her, lips pressed together. It had been a long time since he had heard someone call him son with such warmth. Late in the evening, when the customers had thinned, Lucas carefully wiped down the wooden tables once more. Matthew walked over, placing a hand on his shoulder, causing Lucas to flinch. Matthew looked him straight in the eyes, his gaze firm but no longer cold. "The first day isn't easy, is it?" Lucas nodded, his voice hoarse. "But I don't want to give up." Matthew nodded gently. "Good. Don't ever give up. Here, everyone has stumbled, but we learn how to stand up." Lucas looked up at Matthew, tears welling in his eyes, then lowered his head, whispering, "Thank you for giving me a chance." Matthew took a deep breath, feeling something inside his chest begin to melt. A wall that had been built for years finally starting to crack, as he realized sometimes giving isn't losing, but the way we find ourselves again. When Lucas left the shop that night, he turned back to bow to Ava and Matthew before running into the rainy night, his old shoes splashing through the puddles, but his steps no longer as heavy as before. Ava watched him go, her eyes shimmering as she softly said, "He's going to be okay, Matthew." Matthew crossed his arms, nodding, his eyes still on the door that had just closed. "He's going to be okay, and so will we." In that moment, Matthew knew that Crane's Hearth was no longer just a bakery. It had become a home, a place where people who had once lost their way could find themselves again, where waffles were not just for sale, but a way to heal the quiet wounds in people's hearts. And he knew this journey was only just beginning. On his second day of work, Lucas arrived at Crane's Hearth before the sky even began to lighten. He sat on the cold stone steps, his torn backpack leaning beside him, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie, eyes watching the flow of people beginning to walk down the street, the headlights of cars casting streaks of light across the wet pavement. Ava appeared with a cup of hot cocoa. "Next time, if you come this early, wait inside." "Okay." Lucas took the cocoa, his hands trembling as he held it tightly, the warm scent of chocolate and cinnamon drifting into his breath. I was just afraid I wouldn't get here on time." Ava looked at him, her eyes softening. "We're not afraid of you being late. We're only afraid you'll give up." Lucas pressed his lips together, nodding, his eyes shimmering as he took a sip of the hot cocoa, his small, thin shoulders trembling as the warmth spread down his throat, heating a part of him that had been cold for so long. That day, Matthew had Lucas learn how to make coffee. He stood beside him, his eyes strict, holding a milk pitcher, demonstrating as he explained. Making coffee isn't just pouring water into a machine. You have to listen to the sounds, pay attention to the smells, watch the temperature, and create a cup that's just hot enough, just fragrant enough. Lucas focused so hard he forgot to breathe, his hands shaking as he held the milk pitcher, the steam from the frothing wand fogging up his old glasses. Milk spilled over the edge of the cup, dripping down onto the counter, and Lucas hurried to wipe it up. Flustered. I'm sorry. Matthew didn't scold him, only crossed his arms and said in an even tone, "Wipe it up and try again." After 3 failed attempts, Lucas finally managed to create a smooth foam on top of his first latte. He looked at it, then at Matthew, his eyes shining. I did it." Matthew didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Now take it to the customer, and don't spill it." Lucas nodded, his hands trembling as he carried the tray, but steadier than the day before as he slowly made his way to the customer's table. Table 6 was occupied by a middle-aged man in a dark suit, holding a laptop, looking busy. Lucas set the latte down carefully. "Here's your coffee, sir." The man looked up, pausing for a moment as he saw the young face, the trembling hands, the shy but determined eyes. He smiled. "Thank you, young man." Lucas bowed his head slightly, offering a small smile as he walked away. When he glanced back from the counter, he saw the man take a sip, nodding in satisfaction. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt he had done something good. Midway through the day, the shop was busy. Lucas carried trays, wiped tables, took out the trash. Once, in his hurry, he slipped, the tray crashing to the floor, coffee splattering, the cup shattering into pieces. The shop fell silent for a few seconds, eyes turning toward him. Lucas froze, his eyes red, hands shaking. Old memories flooded back, being thrown out of stores, contemptuous looks, harsh words. Matthew walked over, looking at the shattered cup, then at Lucas, his voice low. "Are you okay?" Lucas pressed his lips together, tears brimming, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I'll leave." Matthew placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, stay. Clean it up. Then keep going." Lucas looked up into Matthew's eyes and saw no anger, no contempt, only patience. He dropped to his knees, carefully picking up each shard, wiping away each drop of coffee, his hands trembling but determined. When he finished, Lucas sat down in the corner of the kitchen, covering his face, tears falling onto the cold tile floor. Ava sat down beside him, handing him a towel. "This won't be the last time you make a mistake. But if you keep getting back up, you're moving forward." Lucas looked up, tears still clinging to his eyelashes, looking at Ava. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Ava smiled, her eyes glinting. "Because someone once did the same for me, and I want to keep that going." At the end of the day, when the customers had gone, Lucas and Ava wiped down the counters, cleaned up, getting ready to close. Matthew stood at the counter, looking at him, speaking softly. "Tomorrow, you can come back." Lucas looked at Matthew, his eyes lighting up, no longer filled with the fear of the first day, but with the look of someone who was finding hope. I will come back. Thank you for giving me this chance." Matthew nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled a small but warm smile. "Tomorrow will be better than today." That night, Lucas left the shop, stepping out into the cold street, but his steps were no longer heavy. His hands clutched the apron Ava had given him to take home to wash, a reminder that tomorrow he would get to return, to begin again. And back inside the bakery, Matthew stood by the window, watching the streetlights reflecting in the rain, feeling a strange peace. He understood that sometimes a waffle isn't just something to sell, but a chance for someone to find themselves again, and for him to find a part of himself he had long lost. The next morning, Crane's hearth was filled with the smell of waffles and hot coffee as the faint sunlight pierced through the fogged windows. Lucas stood in front of the mirror in the employee restroom, his hands trembling as he tied the apron strings, adjusting his collar, smoothing down his messy hair. He took a deep breath, looking straight into his own eyes in the mirror, whispering to himself, "Today, I'll do better than yesterday." Walking out to the counter, Lucas saw Matthew wiping down the espresso machine, his gaze stern but softening when he saw him. "Early, aren't we?" Lucas nodded, a small smile flickering across his face, his eyes still holding worry but less fear than before. Ava stepped out from the kitchen, holding a tray of fresh pastries. "Want to learn how to arrange these?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. Ava set the tray down, showing him how to place the golden waffles neatly on the display, facing outward, tidy, inviting. He worked slowly, carefully, his hands still trembling slightly. One waffle slipped from his hand, rolling onto the floor. Lucas bent down to pick it up, his face flushing red. "I'm sorry." Ava shook her head. "It's okay. Keep going." That day, Matthew taught Lucas how to take orders. The shop was busy, the bell over the door jingling constantly, the air warm and lively. Lucas stood behind the counter, holding a notepad, listening carefully as customers ordered lattes, waffles, almond cakes. He wrote them down, reading them back to confirm, his voice small but clear. After a while, Matthew came up behind him, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. "Speak up a bit so they can hear you." Lucas took a deep breath, lifted his head, looking at the customer, trying to smile. "One hot latte and a waffle." "Is that right?" The customer, a young woman, busy, in a rush, paused, then smiled. "That's right. Thank you." Lucas nodded, wrote it down, turned away. But a small grin tugged at the corner of his lips, and for the first time he felt useful, seen. During his break, Lucas sat in a small corner, holding a cup of cocoa, looking out the window. Outside, a homeless man sat leaning against a lamppost, clutching a cloth bag, his head bowed as he slept. Lucas went still, his hand tightening around the cup, memories flooding back. That had once been him. Cold nights, curled up on street corners, stomach growling, too afraid to ask anyone for help. Ava sat down beside him, placing a wrapped waffle in his hand. "Take it to him." Lucas turned to her, eyes wide. "Can I? Really?" Ava nodded. "Someone once helped us. Now it's your turn." Lucas stood, walking slowly to the door, holding the warm waffle. He stepped in front of the sleeping man, took a breath, and gently placed the waffle into his hand. The man woke with a start, looking up, his tired eyes meeting Lucas's. Lucas smiled, nodding. "I hope you have a good day, sir." The man looked at the waffle in his hand, his lips trembling, and a tear fell. "Thank you, thank you." Lucas returned to the shop, his eyes bright, his hands trembling slightly from emotion. Ava smiled, welcoming him back. "How did it feel?" Lucas took a deep breath, his voice raspy. "Now I understand why people did that for me." Later that day, when the customers had left, Matthew stood next to Lucas as they wiped down the counter. Matthew spoke. "Lucas, do you know why I let you stay?" Lucas was quiet, then shook his head. Matthew placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because you didn't give up, even though you were scared. Because you came back, even when you thought you didn't deserve to." Lucas bit his lip, tears welling, his voice cracking. "I was afraid I would disappoint everyone." Matthew looked him straight in the eye, his voice deep but warm. "Failure isn't when you make mistakes. Failure is when you give up before you've learned how to get back up." That night, Lucas left the shop, walking down the street shimmering under the glow of city lights, his hand clutching the apron against his chest, his head held higher, his steps steadier. He knew that tomorrow he would come back again, learn again, make mistakes again, but he would get back up again. And inside him, for the first time in years, there was a warm glimmer of hope that he was starting to belong somewhere. Inside the bakery, Matthew stood looking out the window, watching Lucas's figure fade into the distance. He smiled softly, whispering, "I was once given a chance, and today I've passed it on." The next day, the gentle sun shone through the bakery's windows at Crane's hearth. casting golden light across the dark wooden floors. Lucas arrived early, standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his apron, taking a deep breath before stepping out to the counter. Ava was arranging flowers in a small vase by the door, and when she saw him, she smiled. "Good morning, Lucas." Lucas returned a small smile. "I'm going to try to do better than yesterday." That morning, Matthew decided to let Lucas try working the counter for an hour, taking orders and making coffee. He stood behind him, arms crossed, his eyes serious but patient. The first customer to enter was a young woman with a little girl around 5 years old, her hair in pigtails, eyes wide with curiosity as she looked around the bakery. Lucas took a breath, holding his order pad. "Hi, what can I get for you today?" The woman smiled. "1 almond milk latte and a hot cocoa for her." Lucas nodded, repeating clearly, a slight spark of confidence in his eyes. 1 almond milk latte and 1 hot cocoa. I'll bring them out shortly." He walked over to the coffee machine, his hands shaking slightly as he held the milk jug, but he steadied himself. Remembering Matthew's words, "Listen to the steam. Smell the aroma." The steam wand hissed, the milk gradually foaming evenly. Lucas carefully poured the smooth milk onto the latte, his hands damp with sweat, but his eyes shining as he created an even foam. He turned to prepare the hot cocoa for the little girl, placing a small marshmallow on top, the warmth softening it, releasing a gentle sweetness into the air. As he carried the tray over, the little girl's eyes lit up when she saw the cocoa. "Mommy, there's a marshmallow." The mother laughed. "Thank you so much." Lucas bowed his head slightly and stepped back. But when he looked up, he saw Matthew watching him. For the first time, Matthew gave a small nod, his eyes softening, his lips curving into a gentle smile. Lucas felt his heart pound, a small happiness rising within him, knowing he had done it, that he hadn't given up. That afternoon, the bakery was busy. Lucas carried trays, brought water, wiped tables, and took orders. He was tired, but he didn't complain, didn't give up. Step by step, he learned to listen to the customers, to watch them, and to smile as they left. Later, as he was wiping down a table, an elderly man walked into the shop. His hair and beard were white, his old coat frayed at the shoulders, his shoes worn out. He stood hesitantly in front of the free pastry shelf. Lucas noticed, put down his rag, and walked over. "Can I help you, sir?" The old man looked up, his eyes tired but holding a flicker of shame. "I just wanted to ask for a piece of bread." Lucas smiled gently, taking a waffle and placing it into his hand. "You don't have to ask here. If you need it, please take it." The old man held the waffle, tears welling in his eyes, his voice trembling. Thank you, son." He turned and walked away, each step slow but firm, clutching the waffle like a small treasure in a world that had long forgotten him. Lucas stood watching, a pang in his chest, but also a warmth. He understood that he had just passed on what Ava and Matthew had once given him a chance to feel human again. Later that day, as the shop quieted, Lucas and Ava cleaned the counters. Matthew stood nearby, watching with his arms crossed. Lucas set the tray down in the kitchen, turned around, and with all the courage he had, said, "Thank you for letting me stay." Matthew didn't answer immediately. He just looked at him, then replied, "Thank you for not giving up." Lucas looked at Matthew, tears brimming. "I used to think I didn't deserve anything, that I couldn't do anything good, that I couldn't start over." Matthew placed a hand on his shoulder. "I used to think that too." Lucas looked up, surprised. Matthew sighed, his gaze distant. "I once slept on the streets, hungry, thinking I wasn't worth living. But one day, a man paid for the bread I couldn't afford. And he only said, 'When you can, pass it on to someone else.'" He looked directly into Lucas's eyes. "Today, I passed it on to you, and one day you will pass it on too." Lucas bit his lip, tears streaming down his face. But he didn't wipe them away, didn't feel ashamed. He knew, in that moment, he belonged here, no longer invisible in a world that had ignored him for so long. That evening, Lucas left the shop, bowing his head to Ava and Matthew. "I'll be back tomorrow." Ava smiled. "We'll be waiting." Matthew nodded, a glint of trust in his eyes. "Tomorrow, we'll begin again." The next day, Crane's hearth welcomed the morning with the scent of waffles and the glow of sunlight filtering through the old glass windows. Lucas arrived wearing his old hoodie, now freshly washed, his apron neatly folded in his backpack, stepping inside with determined eyes. Ava was preparing a tray of pastries, turning and smiling. "Early today." "Huh." Lucas nodded, his eyes bright with resolve. "I want to learn how to make lattes today." Matthew, wiping down the espresso machine, paused, turning to look at Lucas. In those stern eyes, there was, for the first time, a clear trust. "All right. Come here." Lucas stepped up, standing beside Matthew, watching him measure the coffee, tamp it with just the right pressure, start the machine, listening to the sound, breathing in the hot aroma of coffee blending with the hiss of steaming milk. Matthew handed him the milk jug. "Your turn." Lucas's hands trembled, but he took a deep breath, focusing, tilting the jug at the right angle, listening to the sound, feeling the slight vibration as the milk foamed. The first time, the milk overflowed, spilling onto the counter. Lucas quickly wiped it up, his face flushing red. "I'm sorry." Matthew crossed his arms, looking at him. "Do it again." The second time, the foam was too thick to pour evenly. Lucas panted, tears welling, but he shook his head. "I will do it again." Ava, watching from nearby, smiled softly. She saw herself years ago, fumbling by the old coffee machine, hands shaking, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of being fired. The third time, Lucas tilted the jug just right, letting the foam settle evenly, pouring a thin stream, forming a small heart on the surface of the latte. He stared at it, eyes wide, then looked up at Matthew, his voice trembling. I did it." Matthew glanced at the latte, then at Lucas, nodding. "Well done." The first customer of the day was an elderly woman, leaning on a cane, her hair silver. "A latte for me today, please." Lucas bowed slightly. "Yes, ma'am, just a moment." He carefully brought the latte to her table. The woman looked at the small heart on top, her eyes lighting up before she smiled. "It's beautiful." Lucas smiled softly. "I hope you have a warm day." The woman looked at him, her eyes gentle. "You've already given me a good day, son." Lucas turned away, eyes glistening, his heart pounding, and for the first time he felt he could bring joy to someone else. That afternoon, as the customers thinned, Lucas wiped down the counter, and Ava came over, handing him a small folded piece of paper. "This is for you." Lucas opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for the coffee. You reminded me of my son." Lucas clenched the paper in his hand, tears falling as he pressed his lips together to keep from sobbing. Ava placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's what you just did, Lucas." That evening, Matthew called Lucas into the small office behind the counter. He sat down, pointing to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Lucas sat, gripping the paper in his pocket, looking at Matthew, waiting. Matthew looked at him, his voice low. "Lucas, do you know why I gave you a chance?" Lucas lowered his head. "Because I didn't give up." Matthew nodded slightly. "That's right. But there's another reason." He leaned back, his eyes distant. "Years ago, someone helped me with just a loaf of bread. He didn't ask if I was worthy, didn't ask how I would pay it back. He just said, 'When you can, pass it on to someone else.'" Matthew paused, looking at Lucas. "Today, I passed it on to you, and one day you will pass it on too." Lucas looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks, nodding. "I promise, I will." Matthew reached out, placing his hand gently on Lucas's shoulder. "You've already started." That night, Lucas left the shop, standing at the door, looking back at the warm yellow light inside, the last customers leaving, the bell softly chiming. He turned to see Ava waving with a smile, Matthew wiping down the counter, his eyes softening when they met his. Lucas took a deep breath, his heart filled with faith. Tomorrow, I will come back. The next day, Lucas stepped into Crane's hearth while the morning mist still hung in the air. In his hand was a small paper bag. Inside were 2 loaves of bread, bought with the few tips he had carefully saved from the past week. Ava saw him, asking softly, "What do you have there today?" Lucas smiled gently, lifting the bag for the free bread shelf. "I want to start passing it on." Lucas placed the 2 loaves of bread on the shelf near the door, his hands trembling slightly. But there was a small, proud light in his eyes. Just then, a boy around 10 years old, wearing an old jacket and torn shoes, walked in, his eyes glancing at the bread before flickering over to Lucas. Lucas bent down, smiling gently. "If you need one, go ahead and take it." The boy looked at Lucas, hesitation in his eyes, then slowly reached out for a loaf, whispering, "Thank you." He ran outside, clutching the bread to his chest, leaving a warmth in the chilly morning air. Lucas stood watching, his heart stirring. He remembered the first time he received a piece of bread from Ava's hand, how warm her eyes had been that day. The boy reached out to take it, smiling a small smile, but enough to light up his whole face. Tears welled in the woman's eyes as she whispered, "Thank you, young man." Lucas smiled back. "You don't need to thank us. We just want to share." That day, Lucas moved around the shop, straightening the shelves, wiping down tables, watching customers leave with smiles on their faces. He realized that this place had become a part of his life, a place where he was no longer just receiving, but beginning to give back. At the end of the day, Matthew called Lucas and Ava over, and they all sat around the small wooden table in the corner of the shop. Matthew spoke. "Today, we had a good day." He looked at Lucas. "Lucas, you've come a long way since the first day you walked in here." Lucas lowered his head, his voice thick. I used to think I couldn't." Matthew smiled. "Lucas, you've done more than you ever thought you could." Lucas let out a small, emotional laugh, his voice catching. "It's because of you all, because of Crane's Hearth." Matthew nodded. "Sometimes, a small piece of bread, a hot cup of coffee, a smile can change an entire life." Ava looked at Lucas, speaking softly. "And today, you did that for many people." Lucas looked around the small space, the warm light, the scent of pastries, the wooden tables, the small water stains left behind after a long day. It had all become part of his life. He took a deep breath, his eyes shining. "I'll keep going. I want to be able to give to others what I've received." Matthew smiled, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You're already doing that, Lucas." Before leaving the shop, Lucas looked back one last time, the warm lights spilling out from the windows, the bell above the door jingling softly as he stepped out into the crisp night air of the city. He walked down the long street, clutching his apron, a smile on his lips, whispering softly to himself, "Tomorrow I'll be back."